February 11th, 1952. The Lenox Lounge on 125th Street, 3:17 in the morning. Vincent Call Jr. sat in the corner booth with a leather briefcase containing $50,000. Across from him sat William Big Bill Hewlett, 6 feet 4 inches, 240 pounds, a hired gun from Philadelphia with 7 bodies to his name. Vincent checked his watch again. Bumpy Johnson's representative was supposed to be here 20 minutes ago. Big Bill's hand stayed under the table, fingers wrapped around a .45 caliber pistol. He didn't like this, didn't like waiting, didn't like Harlem. Vincent leaned forward and whispered something about patience, about respect, about how Bumpy was testing them. Big Bill didn't respond. His eyes scanned the room, the bartender, the back exit, the man at the bar who hadn't touched his drink in 30 minutes. That man was Joseph Turner, Little Joe, Bumpy Johnson's personal bodyguard. The man who had killed 9 people in 5 years and never spent a night in jail. The man who never missed. Joe set down his glass and started walking toward their booth. Big Bill's instincts screamed. He started pulling the gun from under the table, started to turn. Joe closed the distance in 4 steps. His Smith & Wesson .38 Special came up fast. The barrel pressed against Big Bill's temple, point blank. Big Bill's eyes went wide. Joe pulled the trigger. The gunshot cracked through the room like thunder. Big Bill's head snapped sideways. His body went limp and crashed forward onto the table. Blood sprayed across the briefcase, across Vincent's face, across the wall. Vincent's mouth opened but no sound came out. Joe turned the gun on him. Vincent raised his hands and started begging, started offering money, information, anything. Joe shot him twice, once in the chest, once in the throat. Vincent slammed backward into the wall and slid down, leaving a streak of red. His hands clutched at his neck. Blood poured between his fingers. He stared at Joe with dying eyes that couldn't understand what had just happened. Within 90 seconds, 2 men were dead, and the power structure of New York's underworld had changed forever. Bumpy Johnson didn't build his empire by being the toughest man in Harlem. He built it by being the smartest, by knowing who to trust and who to eliminate, by understanding that respect wasn't given, it was taken and defended with blood. By 1952, Bumpy had survived things that killed most men twice over. He had survived Dutch Schultz, survived Lucky Luciano, survived Alcatraz, survived betrayals from his own crew. He had learned that power in Harlem wasn't about violence, it was about calculated violence. It was about knowing when to negotiate and when to send a message so brutal that nobody would forget it. And when the Italians started pushing north into his territory, when they started thinking he was weak because he had spent time in prison, when they started sending men like Vincent Call Jr. to broker deals that were really just disguised takeovers, Bumpy knew it was time to remind everyone who Harlem belonged to. Joseph Turner grew up on 138th Street, watching men talk themselves into early graves. He learned early that silence was a weapon, that observation was power, that the men who survived weren't the loudest, they were the ones who acted while others were still talking. By 16, Joe had killed 2 men who tried to rob his mother's store. By 20, he was working for Bumpy Johnson. By 25, he had a reputation that made seasoned gangsters nervous. He didn't posture, didn't make threats, didn't waste breath explaining what he was going to do. He just did it. And that made him more dangerous than men twice his size. Bumpy trusted Joe because Joe had proven over and over that loyalty wasn't negotiable, wasn't conditional, wasn't for sale. In a world where everyone had a price, Joe was the exception, and that made him invaluable. The winter of 1952 brought more than cold weather to Harlem. It brought pressure. The Italian families were expanding, the Genovese crew, the Lucchese crew, the Colombos. They looked at Harlem and saw opportunity. They saw Bumpy getting older, spending time in and out of prison, fighting battles on too many fronts. They thought his grip was slipping. They thought wrong. But perception was almost as dangerous as reality. If people believed Bumpy was weak, they would act on that belief. And once that started, it would cascade. Rivals would get bold. Allies would reconsider their loyalties. The whole structure could collapse. Bumpy understood this. Which is why when Vincent Call Jr. came around talking about partnerships and mutual benefits, Bumpy didn't shut him down immediately. He listened. He played along. He let Vincent think a deal was possible. Because sometimes, the best way to eliminate a threat was to let it walk right into the trap. Vincent Call Jr. inherited his uncle's name, but none of his instincts. Mad Dog Call had been a psychopath, but he had been smart. Unpredictable in a strategic way, Vincent Jr. was just reckless. He had money from his family's operations in Connecticut. He had connections to the Italian families in New York. He had ambition that outweighed his intelligence. He wanted a piece of Harlem's policy rackets, the numbers game that generated millions of dollars a year. He thought he could walk into Bumpy's territory, flash some cash, make some promises, and walk out with a partnership. He brought $50,000 as a gesture of good faith. He brought Big Bill Hewlett as insurance. He thought that was enough. He didn't understand that in Harlem, money without respect was just paper, and muscle without loyalty was just meat. Big Bill Hewlett was a professional. He had worked for the Irish, the Italians, the Jews, whoever paid the most. He had no code beyond getting paid and staying alive. That made him effective in certain situations, but it also made him predictable. Men like Big Bill operated on simple logic, threat assessment, risk versus reward, exit strategies. They didn't factor in things like honor or legacy, or the kind of loyalty that made men willing to die for a principle. Bumpy had dealt with hundreds of men like Big Bill. They were tools, useful until they weren't, and the moment they became a liability, they needed to be discarded. Big Bill's mistake was thinking this meeting was about negotiation. It wasn't. It was about elimination. The meeting was set up carefully. Vincent reached out through intermediaries, said he wanted to talk, said he had a proposal that would benefit everyone, said he respected Bumpy and wanted to avoid conflict. Bumpy sent word back that he was interested, that he would send someone to hear the proposal, that they should meet somewhere neutral, public enough to be safe, private enough to talk business. Vincent suggested the Lenox Lounge, late night, after the crowd cleared out. Bumpy agreed, but he never intended to send a negotiator. He sent an executioner. Joe got his orders 3 days before the meeting. Simple, clear, no room for interpretation. Vincent Call Jr. doesn't leave Harlem alive. Make it loud. Make it public. Make sure everyone knows what happens when someone disrespects this territory. Joe didn't ask questions, didn't need details, didn't require justification. Bumpy said it needed to happen, so it would happen. That was the relationship. That was the code. Joe spent those 3 days preparing, learned Vincent's routine, learned about Big Bill, learned the layout of the Lenox Lounge, identified exits, calculated angles, planned contingencies. By the time February 11th arrived, Joe knew exactly how it would go down. Vincent arrived at the Lenox Lounge at 2:50 in the morning. He wore an expensive suit, carried the briefcase like it was a crown. Big Bill walked beside him, eyes scanning for threats. They took the corner booth, ordered drinks they didn't touch, waited. Vincent kept checking his watch, kept asking Big Bill if he thought something was wrong. Big Bill told him to relax, told him these things always ran late, told him Bumpy was probably just making them sweat. But Big Bill's hand never left the gun under the table. His instincts were screaming that something was off. The bartender was too quiet. The place was too empty. The man at the bar, the one who had been nursing the same drink for half an hour, that man was too still, too focused. Big Bill had seen killers before, recognized the posture, the calm, the way they didn't fidget or look around nervously, the way they just waited like predators. He leaned toward Vincent and started to say they should leave. That's when Joe moved. Joe crossed the distance faster than Big Bill could react. His movements were efficient, no wasted motion, no hesitation. The .38 special came up smooth and steady, pressed against Big Bill's temple before the big man's gun cleared the table. Big Bill's eyes locked with Joe's for a fraction of a second. In that moment, he understood. There was no negotiation, no escape, no mercy, just the end. Joe pulled the trigger without blinking. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Big Bill's skull shattered. Brain matter and bone fragments sprayed across the booth. His massive body jerked once and collapsed forward, crashing onto the table with enough force to crack the wood. The briefcase bounced and landed on the floor. $50,000 in cash surrounded by spreading blood. Vincent screamed, or tried to. The sound caught in his throat. His brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. Big Bill was supposed to be invincible. Big Bill was supposed to protect him. Big Bill was dead, and Vincent was alone with a killer. Joe turned the gun toward Vincent's chest. Vincent's hand shot up automatically. He started talking fast, desperate, offering everything. The money, more money, information on the Italian families, names, locations, bank accounts, anything, everything. Joe's expression didn't change, didn't acknowledge the words, didn't register the pleading. He squeezed the trigger twice. The first bullet punched through Vincent's sternum and collapsed his lung. The second tore through his throat and severed his carotid artery. Vincent slammed backward into the wall. His hands went to his neck instinctively. Blood pumped between his fingers in rhythmic spurts. He tried to speak but only produced a wet, gurgling sound. His legs gave out and he slid down the wall. His expensive suit soaked through with red. His eyes stayed open, staring at Joe with a mixture of shock and confusion, watching his killer calmly holster the weapon while his life drained onto the floor. Joe stood there for 10 seconds, making sure both men were finished, making sure there were no surprises. Then he bent down and picked up the briefcase, wiped blood off the leather with his handkerchief, looked at the bartender who was staring straight ahead at the bottles behind the bar, seeing nothing, hearing nothing. Joe walked to the back exit, pushed through the door into the cold February night. The alley was empty. The street beyond was dark and quiet. Somewhere distant, a dog barked. A car drove past 3 blocks away. The city continued like nothing had happened, like 2 men hadn't just been executed, like the balance of power hadn't just shifted. Joe walked 4 blocks north, got into a car that had been waiting, drove to a warehouse on 145th Street where Bumpy was playing cards with 3 associates. Joe set the briefcase on the table, didn't say a word, didn't need to. Bumpy looked at the blood on the leather, looked at Joe's calm expression, nodded once. Joe nodded back. The message had been delivered. The bodies were discovered at 4:30 in the morning when the cleaning crew arrived. The bartender was long gone. So were the 2 men who had been waiting in the kitchen, Bumpy's insurance, there to make sure Joe could walk out clean. The police showed up 20 minutes later. Detectives arrived by 6. They questioned everyone in the neighborhood. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. The Lenox Lounge had been empty. The bartender didn't work there anymore, couldn't be found. The owner claimed he had left at midnight, had no idea what happened. The detectives knew they were being lied to, knew someone had witnessed everything. But in Harlem, cooperation with police was a death sentence. People protected their own, even when their own included killers, especially then. Word spread through the underworld before the sun came up. Vincent Call Jr. was dead. Big Bill Hewlett was dead. Killed execution style at a supposed negotiation. The Italian families were furious. The Genovese crew wanted retaliation, wanted blood, wanted to send a message back. But the older bosses, the ones who had been around long enough to understand how Harlem worked, they hesitated. Because this wasn't random violence. This was calculated. This was Bumpy Johnson reminding everyone that his territory wasn't for sale. That attempts to move in wouldn't be met with negotiations or warnings. They would be met with bodies. The older bosses knew that starting a war over Vincent Call Jr., a reckless kid who had gotten himself killed through stupidity, wasn't worth the cost. So they made calls, smoothed things over, blamed Vincent for overstepping, blamed him for disrespecting protocols, and quietly, they backed off. Not completely, but enough. Little Joe became a ghost story after that night. People talked about him in whispers, the man who killed 2 armed men in seconds, the man who walked out with the money, the man who never got caught, never got questioned, never showed a hint of remorse. Young criminals coming up wanted to be like him, wanted that reputation, wanted that level of respect, but they didn't understand what it cost. Didn't understand that men like Joe didn't do what they did for glory or recognition. They did it because it was necessary, because someone had to, because the code demanded it. Joe continued working for Bumpy for 16 more years, through wars with other crews, through federal investigations, through shifting alliances. He was there when Bumpy got released from Alcatraz in 1963, was there standing guard while Bumpy rebuilt his network, was there in 1968 when Bumpy collapsed at Wells Restaurant from a massive heart attack. Joe was one of the men who carried the casket at Bumpy's funeral. One of the men who made sure the old boss went out with honor. And after Bumpy died, Joe stepped back, faded into the background, lived quietly, never spoke about the old days, never wrote a book, never gave interviews. He worked legitimate jobs, drove a truck, lived in a small apartment on 142nd Street, died in his sleep in 1984 at age 63. Only 18 people attended his funeral. But those 18 knew who he really was, knew what he had done, knew that without men like Joe, empires like Bumpy's couldn't exist. The Lenox Lounge stayed open for decades. The booth where Vincent and Big Bill died became legendary. Regulars would point it out to newcomers, tell the story, embellish details, turn it into mythology. Some of the story was true, some wasn't, but the core remained accurate. On February 11, 1952, Bumpy Johnson sent a message that couldn't be misunderstood. That message was delivered by a quiet man with a steady hand and absolute loyalty. And that message echoed through Harlem's criminal underworld for generations. The sound of that gunshot, the one that killed Big Bill Hewlett, became more than just noise. It became a symbol, a warning, a reminder that some territories couldn't be bought, some men couldn't be intimidated, some codes couldn't be broken. The $50,000 Vincent brought never surfaced publicly. Rumors said Bumpy distributed it to families of men who had been killed defending his operations. Other rumors said it went to lawyers defending members of his crew. Some said Joe kept it as payment for a job well done. The truth disappeared with the men who knew it. But the money didn't matter as much as what it represented. Vincent thought cash could buy him power in Harlem, thought money was the currency that mattered. He died learning that respect was the only currency worth having, and respect couldn't be purchased. It had to be earned through action, through loyalty, through being willing to pull the trigger when everyone else hesitated. Years later, when the old Harlem started dying, when urban renewal tore down buildings and displaced communities, when crack cocaine changed the nature of the streets, when new generations came up with different rules, some things remained constant. The stories, the legends, the names that still commanded respect even in death. Bumpy Johnson, Stephanie St. Clair, Ellsworth Raymond, and quietly, among those who knew, Joseph Turner. Little Joe, the bodyguard who never missed, the man who killed 2 armed men in the time it took most people to realize what was happening. The man who proved that loyalty wasn't just a word, it was action, it was blood. It was standing next to someone even when that meant standing in the line of fire. The detectives who investigated the Lenox Lounge murders never closed the case. It remained open for decades, unsolved, officially. But everyone knew the truth. The police knew, the criminals knew, the neighborhood knew. Justice in Harlem didn't always happen in courtrooms. Sometimes it happened in back booths of nightclubs at 3 in the morning. Sometimes it was delivered by quiet men who understood that the law of the streets was older and more binding than any statute. Sometimes the sound of a gunshot was the only verdict that mattered. The Italian families learned their lesson that night. They continued operating in New York, continued making money, continued building their empires. But they learned to respect boundaries, learned that Harlem wasn't theirs for the taking, learned that Bumpy Johnson wasn't a relic of a bygone era. He was still the most dangerous man north of 110th Street. And he was dangerous because he had men like Joe Turner, men who didn't need speeches or explanations or motivation, men who just acted when action was required, men who understood that in a world built on violence and respect, hesitation was death and loyalty was life. Vincent Call Jr. was buried in Connecticut 3 days after he died. His family held a funeral, called him a businessman, called him a victim of a senseless crime, never mentioned why he was in Harlem, never mentioned the $50,000, never mentioned the deal he was trying to broker. Big Bill Hewlett was buried in Philadelphia with no ceremony, no mourners, just a casket in the ground and a headstone with dates. The men who hired him didn't claim the body for 2 weeks, didn't pay for the burial, didn't acknowledge he had worked for them. That's what happened to mercenaries. They were useful until they weren't, and then they were forgotten. But Joe Turner wasn't forgotten. Not by the people who mattered. Not by the old-timers who understood what Harlem used to be. Not by the few remaining members of Bumpy's crew who carried the stories forward. They remembered the night at the Lenox Lounge, remembered the sound of the gunshot, remembered what it meant. It meant that power wasn't given, it was taken and defended. It meant that respect was written in blood. It meant that some men were willing to do what others couldn't. And those men, the quiet ones, the loyal ones, the ones who pulled the trigger without hesitation, those men built empires. Not with their names and lights, not with fame or fortune, but with action, with sacrifice, with an understanding that the code mattered more than survival. The sound of that gunshot still echoes. Not literally, but in memory, in stories, in the way people still talk about Bumpy Johnson and the crew that kept him alive and in power. In the way younger generations who never knew that era still recognize the names and respect the legacy. In the way Harlem remembers its own. Not with monuments or plaques, but with stories passed down, lessons taught, codes upheld. The sound that changed history wasn't just the physical crack of a .38 special firing at point-blank range. It was what that sound represented. The end of one era and the reinforcement of another. The message that Harlem belonged to those who had earned it. And anyone who forgot that would end up like Vincent Call Jr., dead on a floor, their plans still in their head, their blood soaking into wood that would outlast their memory.